Hello and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. If you're not subscribed, subscribe, hit the like button, share this with your friends, comment, and enjoy the following podcast I did on the Brown Pundits podcast.
The Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Brown Pundits Browncast. Today, your hosts are myself, Mukunda and Shahada Hassan, and we are joined by an amazing guest that is going to talk to us about her life and also her passion, which is racelessness. And this is Dr. Sheena Mason. Dr. Mason, welcome to our program. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. I heard about you from a friend of mine a few months ago, and I've looked at some of your work, and I did start looking at your dissertation, and I couldn't finish it yet because I had so much work this week, but I got through some of it, and so I thought it was a very interesting idea. So, but before we get into that, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself and like what your journey was? Because your journey is actually pretty interesting, just as your work is.
Yeah, so I'm from upstate New York, a very small town in the United States. I'm adopted. Two of my brothers died under suspicious circumstances with my biological family. So the state of New York took my sisters and I away. But then, ironically, paradoxically, I ended up suffering abuse at the hands of my adoptive family. This led to my turning to literature and education in school as a sort of safe haven, as a way to imagine a world that was far outside of what my reality was. And I attribute my success today to this fact that I had the privilege of having access to any book that I wanted, that I had a decent education. And a lot of my, what I would call social justice work or activism, is rooted in this idea of knowledge as having such transformative and liberatory powers. Outside of that, I've earned my doctorate from Howard University in May 2021. My forthcoming book is a better version of my dissertation. It's less dissertation-y and more book. It is for a broader audience, but it's still using literary studies as a case study to sort of prove my point and then also offer solutions that I see as applicable in other spaces. And speaking to that application, my consulting business, Theory of Racelessness, works to help people do just that, to take this seemingly academic, lofty, highfalutin idea of racelessness and figure out how to apply it practically through human resources and diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. We're really trying to penetrate every field, every discipline, because we believe that we have the solution to what is today a currently divisive situation in the United States.
Sure. I mean, we'll touch upon quite a few of those things, but also in your background, like I think before you got a PhD, you were working for it in a whole different field, right? So, like, what spurred the shift from the business life and the that kind of life into wanting to get your PhD and going down this path?
Yeah. So when I was an undergraduate and I was a student's commencement speaker, the local newspaper caught wind of my story and they published an article on me, and that was in 2007. And in that article, I say that I want to get my PhD, and that after I get my PhD, I want to have a nonprofit youth center in a high-risk neighborhood. So it was always in my journey to get a PhD. It's just that because I was estranged from my adoptive family because of the abuse that I underwent, I didn't have the support system or the resources to financially be able to go degree to degree to degree. So I took a couple digressions, if you will, and I used those gap years as an opportunity to build my business acumen, since my intent was to do something in business even after getting my PhD. And I did Teach for America. I was a Houston, Texas core member. I worked for 24 Hour Fitness. I lived in, I want to say, 5 states for them. I kept getting promoted and recruited out to other states to basically solve the problems that the different locations were having in different capacities. And most recently, I ended that career in San Jose, California, where I had a club of something like 100 employees. and I was a general manager, and I was able to really perfect my craft of figuring out how to work with people, because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, people are the best asset that any organization can have. So I feel like bringing that knowledge into the theory of racistness work that I'm doing, you're right, it is a lesser known fact because people tend to see PhD and then they make all these presumptions about what my path has looked like. But actually, I have extensive experience in business, in the nonprofit sector, that I'm applying alongside what could be deemed my academic work. And so in 2016, I finally had the financial capacity to move to Washington, D.C. and pursue my PhD. And so that's exactly what I did.
And are you still in the DC area right now?
No, so actually, I'm an assistant professor at SUNY Oneonta in Oneonta, New York. It's funny how things kind of come full circle. It's not upstate New York, but it's central New York,
Yeah.
a small town. And yeah, I teach all things African American, American and Caribbean literature, but even diasporic literature more broadly at the institute that I'm at now.
Excellent. And we brought up your dissertation a couple times. Can you tell our audience what your dissertation was and how what your book is connected to your dissertation?
Mukunda, it's so strange and surreal to have people talking about my dissertation with me. It's hard to wrap my head around. When I was 17 years old and sleeping on park benches, I dreamt of having the capacity to change the world in any kind of positive way. So I guess it's overwhelming for me and surreal because it feels like I'm closer to that goal if people are talking about my work in any meaningful way. But yeah, so my dissertation, I forget the title now because I've renamed it a few times toward the book, but I can tell you that the current title for my book is Decolonizing the Racialist Imagination in Literary Studies: An Interrogation and Critique of Anti-Racist Discourse. And that would have been the title of my dissertation, except it's a dissertation. And so you have to a certain extent, you do have to, let's see.
Know your audience.
There it is. So I can, but yeah, so in its original format, the dissertation is talking about the theory of racistness, which is really rooted in alternative philosophies of race that people are generally unaware of, and looking at the historical manifestation of these alternative philosophies of race as it pertains to African American literature and literary studies. And within the field, examining how the practice of racialization, the practice of reconstructing race, reconstructing Blackness specifically, how that has looked and how it has resulted in ultimately the marginalization and exclusion of particular types of so-called Black voices. And to me, that marginalization and those practices are an important part of this story, because I don't think it's an accident that people recognize the sort of danger to the status quo, if you will, that alternative philosophies of race bring to the table. And I think the powers that be want as few of us as possible to know about these philosophies. And then I present a 3-part solution to how we can stop unintentionally upholding the system of racism. The 3-part solution: one is a theory as applied to literature. I would now call it my theory of racistness, right? Mm-hmm. The second is looking at a representative writer of racistness, which is Toni Morrison, a writer who's almost never talked about in that way, from that framework. And then also representative pedagogy, where I say, okay, based on these alternative philosophies of race, this is how a class syllabus might look in African American literature or diasporic literature.
Very, very interesting and fascinating. And I think, for our listeners, and I'll, at some point, maybe I'll give you some pushback on this just to flesh it out a bit more. But sorry, Shahada, if I'm like taking this right now, just like.
You know what? One thing that did hit me, Sheena, when you said about your childhood, because I teach in quite an inner city school, and I just wanted to know, where was that moment when racelessness, even before you'd researched it, that it became a bit of your obsession and your focus? Was there a moment in your childhood? Because it seems so traumatic when you speak of your childhood. And I know in the back of my head, people be thinking, is her childhood, as a consequence of her childhood, has that resulted in questioning identity? Do you see what I mean? That's something so traumatic. Did that start off your questioning your identity? And was that trigger you thought, how do I identify myself? And am I a race? Am I just a person? Am I just Sheena? And why do I need to be categorized as well? So I just want to know, where was that first moment in your childhood that triggered your journey into racelessness? Because I assume it wasn't a theory when you were younger that you'd really researched.
Yes. Oh, I love that question. So interestingly, I always focus on race, and I always saw myself as a Black girl, as a Black teen, as a Black woman, as a Black person. So I was very much within the same quagmire that I'm pointing to now and saying, hey, let's talk about this. But the point about questioning identity, I think, even within the race categories that was applied to me as a child, I think that's true, that has always been there, because ultimately, I want to say when I was about 7 or 8 years old, my adoptive mother, that's really when I remember learning that I'm Black. She told me that my adoptive father's family didn't like me because I'm Black. Now, that wasn't reality. She was the abuser, and she wanted to put a divide between me and his side of the family because she wanted to maintain her control in the household, and she didn't want to be found out. And when I got to be that age, I was closer with his side of the family, and I think it scared her. So she weaponized what's supposed to be my race and used it against me, and put that thought in my head that, oh, there are people out there who don't like me because I'm Black. She's Panamanian, if anyone is wondering. So she immigrated, and she was by all intents and purposes brown herself, but she weaponized that against me. And then it was in quick succession after that where I was called pubic hair. I was assaulted on the school bus by a high schooler. I was called the N-word. My brother, who was my brother through the adoption, was chased by a skinhead and shot at, actually with another neighborhood kid, and came home screaming bloody murder. And that the skinhead was, I guess, kicked out of the trailer park that we lived in, and he went back to live with his father in Tennessee or something like that. So I have several moments from my childhood that I remember like yesterday that had to deal with racism and how people racialized me. But then outside of that, as I got to be an undergraduate, then that's when I started experiencing in certain spaces, if I started speaking Spanish, because I did grow up bilingual. As I said, my mom is from Panama. Some people would make fun of my Spanish because it didn't sound like their Spanish. I didn't have the proper accent because I'm also still very Americanized. And then other people said I talk white. They would make fun of how proper I talk and think that was a fun thing to mock. And those people, by society standards, would be mostly racialized Black people saying this to me and making fun of me for that. And so I did continue to experience the violence of racism and the violence of race ideology in such a way that, in addition to my life experiences and who I am when I show up to a certain space, did make me constantly and persistently feel like an outsider. I felt like my ideas and how I looked at the world were often used against me, including things that one wouldn't think would be weaponized against a person, like the fact that I'm 100% serious about anything I do, serious about my scholarship. I'm the student in the class that's always like, I've read every page, and I never found an excuse to not do the homework or be prepared. And the professors love me. And time again, if I was at a PWI or an HBCU, I experienced this othering, and it wasn't always about race, right? It was often about all the things I really valued of myself, like how passionate I am about my work and how much I want to learn and how I attribute learning and education to my own self-empowerment. But yeah, I think that there's a story to be told about that and how that has helped me play in what I call the gray area, or the in-between space of society, where I can look more clear-eyed at certain categories or certain happenings. But even still, toward the end of my doctoral career, I was fighting my own ideas. I don't know if this is something that Glenn Lowry experienced too, or John McWhorter, but I was fighting my own ideas because I very much viewed myself as a strong, proud Black woman, and you couldn't tell me otherwise. And I attributed all of my positive characteristics to my Blackness. And when I started feeling like, okay, the literature and the history are showing me something else, it's showing me that to undo racism, we actually have to undo race. But this is something that we don't talk about, if ever. Once I started seeing that in the literature and the history and the production of how Blackness has been produced, I couldn't let go, but I was terrified. I spent countless hours in my mentor's office, concerned. Like, I didn't want to be that Black person, first of all. I didn't want to be that Black person talking about I'm not Black. I didn't want to let go of what I perceived to be my Blackness. And I didn't want to be further marginalized and excluded because of my ideas. That was a thing, And my mentor, bless her heart, Dr. Dana Williams at Howard University, was so patient and loving with me. And she basically told me something to the effect of, just explore the ideas, keep going down this path, but you don't have to be the martyr. You don't have to be the one to stop calling yourself Black or whatever. That's how she helped me get through it. At the end of my career, right before I defended my dissertation, something finally clicked in my head, and I realized, oh, everything that I'm applying that's positive to my race, my Blackness, isn't race. And finally, I was able to let go. I was finally able to let go of this idea of race and feeling the necessity to apply it to myself, because I was able to recognize what race actually is as it plays out across time and in literature and in society. And if that's what race is, which I identify race as racism, then the only thing I'm letting go with race is the violence of racism. My culture is still what it is. My personality is still what it is. My pride is still what it is. So, but it was a long journey, but I do think that my traumas might have predisposed me to just being more open, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this feels like it's. Oops.
No, go ahead, Shahada. I was just saying that was fantastic. I really appreciate.
That's the first thing that comes into your head. You think, is it a rejection of my identity? But you have to remember that race is the construct, and it is based on colour, and then there is your authenticity as well. And are they different concepts as well? And I just wanted to know that, were you marginalised, and like, how did the Black community or the white community, how did they take your work when you first presented your thesis?
So it's funny, because a lot of my stories of marginalization and exclusion come from people who are sort of like lateral, because this happened to me at 24-hour fitness too. So this happened to me in business too. The people who are at the same level as me often viewed me as somehow a threat, right? And I think that in hindsight, I think that was because they saw something in me that I didn't even recognize. And instead of using it as an opportunity to learn from me or to be in community with me, they othered me and they ostracized me. When I got to Howard University, I experienced some of the same things, but the professors, the faculty, saved the experience for me, because they saw me truly for who I am, and they loved me for it, and they nurtured me. And so there's a way in which, if it weren't for my advisors and my committee members, just putting their feet to the fire, because ultimately my dissertation, it is, I think, forcing them in some ways to question their own ideas about the thing, right? That's a hard happening. That's a hard moment for any of us to really to deal with, when all of a sudden what we think is reality, somebody comes along and in a compelling way, like, questions that reality and shakes it to its core. But fortunately, my advisors were just loving and empathetic enough to go with me on the journey, and from their own viewpoints learn from me as I learned myself. And I can say, by the time it came time to defend my dissertation, and around the same time my book proposal was with Palgrave Macmillan, and I was up for a book contract, I got absolutely nothing but love and support, not just from the faculty, but also from some students that I wouldn't have necessarily assumed that they were going to be supportive of the things that I was saying, right? And that was a really beautiful thing. My defense was virtual because, you know, the pandemic, that's the state of things now. So it's kind of anticlimactic in a way, but it was also really climactic because people from across the country who came to support me, even former students from colleges in the States, they came to support me, and they all were like, wow, like this is something. I don't understand it completely, but but you know, you're making a strong case, and I'm willing to engage with your ideas. I'm willing to read your book when it comes out, and I couldn't ask for anything more. I just want people, for me, it's not about convincing or persuading people. For me, it's truly about educating, because I know that more people than not aren't educated, that there are different ways to look at this thing.
Sure. So I guess to get into the meat of the topic then would be, what is race, right? You know, like, because really to understand racelessness, you have to understand what race is. And we have such competing ideas of what race is, right? Like, you know, is it a skin color? Is it a place of origin? Is it even the complexity of, the complexion of your skin? You know, there's like, you know, more white facing versus darker facing. Like even within South Asian communities, we have this overwhelming desire for being lighter skinned, even though we're a little darker, we're a darker complexion. I mean, and then what is the difference between like race and ethnicity, or race and culture, and race and, you know, I find the conversation with race to be, generally speaking, when we say in the media or when we have a conversation with people, is just used almost ubiquitously for everything, right? Like, you know, this person's a race, that person's a race, and I'm not really sure how, at least in the academic setting, that you're using it, and then like what your theory is built around definition of race here.
Yeah, so by most American definitions, they would say Americans think that race is biological. They think that humans are born into groups of subcategories of humans, essentially. And that idea continues to get propagated, because even in elementary school, I remember being taught this in like a science class, you know, in primary school, that race is biological. And to that extent, people talk about race as, yes, a proxy for skin color, or they talk about race as being indicative of one's ancestry, right? Somebody on the family tree is of African descent, but it is this idea that race is biological, and it's not. It's not biological. It has been disproven as being of nature for well over a century, but somehow in American society, at least, the idea and the belief that that's what race is keeps getting perpetuated. Now, my position on race and what I identify race to be is really racism, because if we look at the genealogy of race, the word race, if we look at the genealogy of the word race, we could trace it back to early modern Europe, the word race was there, but it really was applying to class. It was applying to maybe nationality. And you can see in the early narratives of that time period, going back centuries and centuries, this building of this idea of race as the other, but it wasn't in the racialized ways that Americans tend to think of it now. It had nothing to do with skin color. It had to do more with class and caste. Fast forward to the American context, before America was even America, separate from England, race, the concept of race carries over. But then around 1660, they start to codify the language of race to include the language we think of today: white, black, person of color, etc. And the reason they start to do this around 1660 is because they're starting to do anti-miscegenation laws. They're starting to write whiteness into the power of legal language and legal discourse, so that whiteness was conflated with free, and thereby in a lot of ways empowered, and blackness was conflated with disempowered and enslaved, right? And if you were a free person of color, you were likely black by today's definitions, but you were free, so you had a different political status. And in that way, from 1660 onward, you start having people like Thomas Jefferson start to calculate blackness. At what point does a person stop becoming black? How far in the past does the African descent have to be for a person to start to turn white?
Right.
And their primary motivation for doing this was to decide at what point can a person not be enslaved, essentially, right? Because to be enslaved, one logically, by that logic, has to be black. So you see this clear attempt to racialize Americans in this black and white way, pun intended, and in the creation and in the writing of race in this way, in these ways, comes with it the hierarchy, because racism is what's motivating them ultimately from creating race and writing race in these ways. But people tend to think of it as race creates racism. It's not so. We have a lot of literature. Martin Delaney, I want to say his book, he was a free African in the United States. I want to say his book was like 1856, so before emancipation, all the way to Barbara and Karen Fields, who wrote about it in 2014. All of this literature that says that, by all accounts, this presupposed inferiority or superiority of races actually doesn't start to exist until around the time that I've indicated, like almost the 1700s. And that the inferiority discourse started being brought into the conversation primarily as a means to justify the actions, right? And to keep the popular opinion to be one of that's amenable to enslavement of human beings. So you get this discourse that's pushed afterwards, but initially the hierarchy was simply class and power. But so I say that to say, any way you cut it, since the beginning of the idea of race, the word race, it has indicated a class or caste system. And then that same caste system was brought to the States, but then it was racialized in the ways that we think of it now. And so that's why I'm pointing to race as being the same as racism, because that's how it has played out historically.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think that's that's a strong point. And I think your time frame that you're correlating on the 1600s, late 17th, early 17th century or whatever, roughly corresponds globally, right? You know, what you're looking at is the movement of the Dutch East India Tea Company, the British East India Tea Company, and their drive towards colonialism, expansion, and global growth, in which the times they spent in Asia and Africa, basically at this point, kind of engaging at some superficial level of trade with these people, but with the ultimate goal of disenfranchisement and kind of like this control, right? And the only way you can do that in some way is by dehumanizing the people that you are engaging with previously a business, and now suddenly they are your chattel or your subjects or your, you know, like less than, right? So there's like this, I think a lot of times people, especially in the American context, just really focus on the American context of race. And they forget this is a global story that plays out across, like, it still impacts everywhere across the world, right? Whether you're looking at South America or Asia or Africa or other parts of the world, it's just that story of what race means is still like poignant for people in their day-to-day lives in many ways.
Yeah, the interesting thing about studying race on a more global context is that it doesn't travel everywhere, meaning it doesn't, if it exists in every place, it doesn't travel in the same ways that it is in the American context. And so recently I was talking with somebody who's in Nigeria, and he was telling me how Nigerians, they use race language like white and black, but they actually apply the word white to anyone who's coming from over the seas. So you know, Chinese people are white. He said, I'm white, not because I have lighter complexion, but because I'm American. So I'm just the West, and so I'm coming from the West, and so I'm automatically white in Nigeria. And we were talking about this. What was interesting about that conversation for me is he also acknowledged that until he met me, he believed that race was biological, that, you know, he was like very convinced that I was wrong on that point. But then I think he must have did some research after my conversation with him, and he realized, oh, actually it's not. But even then I was like, he had trouble explaining the logic behind that, because if it is biological, then anyone coming from over the seas can't be white, right? So we didn't really, that didn't really bear out in like the nuanced way that he was looking at it. But ultimately we did determine that, at least for him in Nigeria, race was a neutral descriptor, whereas it was a sort of a matter of fact that somebody is black or somebody is white, as opposed to carrying everything it carries in the US context. And I say that to say that I think more people can be heartened by this realization that race, and thereby racism, don't necessarily travel everywhere as neatly as we're taught in the American context, because it then indicates that, oh, actually it doesn't have to stay this way, right? And it's not this undefeatable, you know, thing, this global thing that we can't beat and change because it's global, right? That's how I look at it.
People always argue it's utopia when you have these discussions. It's not doable. But, you know, I just thinking when you were talking about hierarchy, it exists everywhere, and we're allowing race to be in hierarchy. I mean, we look at conflicts around the world when it's a black person, when it's a Muslim, Arab, we dehumanize them because we're weaponizing that race and subconsciously associating suffering with that race. And we don't associate suffering with our own. Even in America, if you're Asian, black, we don't associate that suffering because we'd be classed as British American. So there's always that association. And, you know, you can equate it. I was thinking about transgender and how we, in such a small amount of time, we've changed the conversation, haven't we, of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I don't see why race can now not have that open discussion. And it is doable, isn't it? That we can deconstruct, because it is construct. Everything's construct, isn't it? Religion, even biology is construct, because you can design biological constructs however you want to have the key factors, isn't it? So I just think, you know, do you feel that it's utopia? Do you feel that you're seeing change, that is something that people will say a tick box that I don't want to, you know, people just put, I don't want to state or other, that it will be an approach that I don't want to be defined by my race, but I'm not denying my identity.
Yeah, that's the hard part, because something we said earlier spoke to the fact that race gets conflated. Race is thought to be this particular thing, but then ironically it gets conflated with everything else, specifically culture and ethnicity, right? And in those ways, when I start talking about racelessness in any space, some people, you know, tighten up and become very hesitant because they're like, wait a second. And this was my own experience too, right? Because I was doing that. I was conflating everything good with the category of race. So there's a way in which we have a lot of unlearning to do. But it is my sincere belief that we can and we will undo it, and we will unlearn it, because once you're able to illustrate how what you're talking about with racelessness is actually uplifting and privileging a person's actual identity, whereas race ideology washes over, homogenizes millions and millions of people around the world to supposedly be the same. We don't, you know, if you're racialized as Asian, or you're racialized as Black, or you're racialized as white, you speak different languages from other people in your race group. You participate in different fashion, you eat different foods, you live in different nations, you know, like the list goes on. And even in a space like the United States, a racialized Black person in the New York is very different from a racialized Black person in Texas. And so it's like, yeah, in this weird way, we hold on to this idea that race is our identity. It's part of our identity. It's part of who we are. But actually, I rebuke the idea that racism is part of who I am, is part of my identity, right? Because I see them as the same thing. And I think once you can show people that actually what race is the racism that creates it, and that who they are would actually come to the forefront, we could have a proliferated understanding of how culture actually works, or ethnicities and things of that nature. We could have a proliferated understanding of individuals within the context of a community, as opposed to presupposing an entire global community that doesn't actually exist. I think that is how we help people stop conflating and see the light as it comes to conceptualizing racelessness. But I also think too, like, so Shahada, you're talking about race as a social construct. So I'm interpreting that as indicative of you being a social constructionist as it pertains to your philosophy of race. I am a race skeptic, which means that I argue that what we identify as race or racial is actually racism camouflaging itself, or it's something cultural, which means it's not race, it's culture, right? Or it's something ethnic, which again means it's not race, it's ethnicity. So in that way, I say there's this apparition of race that exists, which I concede, because I have eyes and I look around me and I hear people saying all the time that race exists, right? But to me, it's just that it is an apparition, that we're pointing to other things and misnaming it as race. And I think that teaching people that philosophy of race, that it actually exists, that there's an alternative even to social constructionism, is also a path forward. And that speaks to my idea of racelessness in one sense, because on one sense, we've been talking about this idea of eliminating it, right? Which would be the goal of racelessness. But for me, racelessness speaks to in two ways, both the goal of eliminating and our present reality is actually being racist human beings. And when you can remove the idea of race from yourself, from how you see other people, it's actually a very liberating process. It's a necessary process, but it also helps people identify the problem of racism more clearly, which then helps us solve the problem of racism more clearly. And it prevents more people than not from being defensive, or, you know, like being too tied into how they feel emotionally about race, which can then also be an obstacle towards solving the problem of racism. So I work to create spaces where, even if it's just temporary, let's imagine ourselves as already raceless, right?
Right.
With the express purpose of examining this thing called racism. And I find it actually helps people stop conflating and stop doing all the things that we've been talking about.
So let me ask you this, because a lot of people would respond saying, well, that's all great and wonderful, this idea, but every day I have to experience someone treating me as if race is there. right? Like constantly being told I'm less than, or given, especially within, the past year of especially George Floyd and the entire movement after that, like, a lot of Black people, African Americans coming out and saying, I don't have that privilege, right? Of saying there's no race or trying to be racelessness when there is a cop that is potentially endangering me walking down the street. No, I have 3 Black stepkids who, I have to think about and constantly, like, I'm not used to thinking that way in terms of thinking about things in racial categories, in terms of I have to think of my stepkids as like being Black, right? As opposed to just being my stepkids. I have to think differently, and this is what I've been told, right? And my question then is, how do people engage with this idea of racelessness when we're being told in every step of the way by both allies and detractors that race is a real thing and we have to deal with it?
Yeah, so this this question inevitably comes up in some form, right, in conversation. So we are racialized in 2 ways. We're racialized by society and we're racialized by ourselves. Now, depending on where you fall on the political spectrum, there's either a hyper focus on the individual, which we could say you lean right if you're hyper focusing on the individual, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you lean left, the tendency is to hyper focus on the community or the society. And so there's a way in which, true to most Western ways of thinking about things, there's a way in which we're trapped in this black and white binary of individual or community, and very few people come to recognize that both both exist, both have power, and both need to happen at the same time. That is to say, I can recognize my power as an individual. I can affirm my power. I can not allow society, because society is doing a thing to me. So society tells me, right? I cannot allow that practice or that act to determine and define me, because I am a human being with power and agency just the same as society is. And if more than enough individuals come to see the world differently, that's how transformation happens in society. And we don't have to look far back in history to find plenty of examples of people who were crazy enough to imagine a world in which they had no context for imagining, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X or Nelson Mandela or Gandhi. There are countless examples that we could point to where you're like, they had no context in which Nelson Mandela had no context to imagine, or almost no reason to imagine, that there could be anything other than apartheid in South Africa, right? But he was crazy enough to be the guy to imagine it. And then he was crazy enough to say the words out loud and share that with the community. And then it spread, right? Like wildfire. And then a very imperfect society, just as America is, even after apartheid, right? But the fact of the matter is that change happened largely because of an individual. And so there's a way in which, in too many times in the United States and elsewhere, we tend to hyper focus on either side of the binary with little recognition of the fact that both things exist at the same time, and both entities, society and an individual, has power. And to your point about, this idea of I don't have that privilege and so on and so forth. Again, if you believe that as an individual you do not have any power, then you don't have the privilege. But if part of your resistance was actually to recognize and believe that as an individual you do have the power, then that to me is liberation. That is resistance, not this narrative of I don't have a choice, I don't have privilege. Because especially when it comes to the conversation about cops and police shootings and things of that nature, the media in America will have us believe, us being people in America, believe that racism is just so rampant that police are out here hunting Black people and murdering us at every turn. And then we pass that on to our children. We have the infamous talk with our children about how they're Black in society. So just as my mom weaponized race against me and put it in my head that I'm the cause of the problem of racism, right? we weaponize that without knowing it, very well intended, and we pass that trauma onto our children so that it informs the way they view themselves and the way they view their society. And very infrequently does anyone actually do the work to look at the statistics when it comes to police shootings, for example. You know, if we look today, there's something like 111 racialized Black people in the US that have been shot by officers since the beginning of the calendar year. Mm-hmm. And every year before that, it's been around like 250, between 200 and 250 for the entire calendar year. But the way that we talk about it, the way that I hear people talking about it's like, oh, police, they're murdering us, they're hunting us down. No, that's
I think Roland Fryer did some work on this.
Yeah, it's not actually happening. But guess what? If you believe that it's happening, you stay divided and you stay conquered. So the powers that be, as I call it, the very small percentage of people in the world that benefit from us believing these things, want us to believe these things and want us to think that it's just rampant because they want us to be divided and they want us to stay conquered.
So we have a choice. I'm going to do a little pushback here because I used to be a prosecutor in New York City. So in Brooklyn, I worked as a prosecutor in Brooklyn for about 3.5, 4 years. And this was in the 2000s, right? Like mid to late 2000s. And this is the period of time when Brooklyn was gentrifying parts of it, Park Slope and what's that? Williamsburg. So I will say this, like, I think the data plays out clearly as you're indicating in terms of shootings, right? And we talk about, but I think there is something to be said with the interactions between police officers and minorities, where I do think there is this clear indication of power being exerted more. And again, this might be a mix of class and race, and not just race, but I do see it happen much more prevalent. I saw it happen more prevalent amongst Black and Latino kids from Brooklyn being treated differently than their white counterparts, or, for example, me counterpart, right? Like if you're an Indian or South Asian or whatever, or even East Asian, you're treated a little better or differently from Black and Latinos. And I do think there is that's a real thing that we have to deal with. Is there is something inherent within the policing system. Not every police officer, but I think the way they engage with populations, maybe it's because these populations they interact with tend to have more violence and crime. I don't know, but I think there's something that has to be talked about there. We just can't brush it aside. But at the same point, I don't think the answer that's given by most media, this is all racially connected, it's all about race, I don't think that's correct either. So there's something going on.
Yeah, and so it might not be clear for listeners unfamiliar with my work that the reason I'm interested in the reason theory of racelessness came about is because of the existence and persistence of racism. So I don't want to fall down the rabbit hole of making it seem like I don't concede the fact that racism exists and is a problem. And I believe that it's systemic, which, I mean, I think other generally like-minded people actually tend to concede that it's systemic, right? However, there is a way in which we continue to misidentify the problem. Mm-hmm. Just as we tend to talk about racism in the language of race, which has enabled us to continue to be within the quagmire of racism because racism is hiding its face from us. And we're focusing on a symptom, which is race, instead of the actual problem, which is racism, right? Just as that is a misidentification, there's a way in which the dominant narrative when it comes to problems of racism is such that we are still showing our unique human ability to misname and misidentify the problems. And in misnaming and misidentifying the problems, what then happens is we are, again, not able to properly solve the actual problems. So and some of that comes from this very binary black and white way of thinking about the world and oneself and one's limited amount of power within a larger community, right? But also there's a difference between internalizing the problem of racism and pointing to the problem of that is racism. And the theory of racelessness, from operating from different philosophical perspectives, actually encourages people to stop internalizing the bad behavior of racists or the problem of racism. Because I hear time and time again from students, from people across the country, who talk about how something happens because they're Black. People don't like them because they're Black. They can't feel safe in a neighborhood or on a college campus because they're Black. That we literally are teaching our young people to continue to view themselves as the problem. That language, whatever follows because, is the cause of the problem. And we are not the problem. We, being racialized Black people or brown people, we are not the problem. The problem is the bad behavior of racists or racism. But because, again, we talk about the problem in the language of race, we've come to frame it in a particular way that has detrimental effects on the same people that we profess to want to liberate. So there's a huge difference between not internalizing the problem of racism while also still pointing to the fact that racism is a problem. And that's the space that I'm coming from here. And also, just to highlight part of what you said, is that the interactions between the police and other people. Now, mind you, it's important to remember that not all police officers are racialized white officers. I don't know the statistics on this, so I can't tell you what the breakdown is, but I just know that the tendency in America is to talk about police as if they're all white and therefore they're racist, and that's not actual reality. It is my assertion that any person can be racist, and if you're upholding race ideology, you are. I think we need to remove the stigma of what it means to be racist, to be more empathetic, to give people time and space to be rehabilitated in certain ways, to be imperfect, right? There's so many dangerous things that are being promoted primarily by the left as it pertains to the problem of racism, that if we keep going down this path and if we keep upholding the ideas, we will literally never get ourselves out, because we will always be focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with you, Shahada. I know I've taken a lot of the questions. You go for
No. One thing I was thinking of, and I was thinking about Black Lives Matters, and for the first time, the white community was under the spotlight, and it's never been the case, really, and because they were associated with oppression. And I remember talking to my white friends about this, and they felt quite fragile, quite my right-wing friends. So I'm just thinking, all of us, all our races, we have our own fragilities associated with it. So I just think for now, with Black Lives Matter, it's a label of the white community to also think I'm being stigmatized, that other communities be stigmatized, because the white community has never really been stigmatized in a way it has recently with Black Lives Matters. I just want to know what your
100 years
were.
they've been kind of stigmatized by us people of different complexion for their oppression. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
but they've
whole,
never owned that. Do you know what I mean? And I think now recently I've seen it in the university campus and with the white community, they've taken ownership of that. And it's never really been the case that it has really been the case. So I think everybody, when your community, your race, your ethnicity is bit under the spotlight, it brings out your own fragilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's just weird to me. It sits weird with me, just like this idea of, like, you know, when we say Black or white, we're talking about an entire swath, like hundreds of millions of people, like we're painting in one brush. And we're suddenly like one person or this group of people today are somehow responsible for what their ancestors did not do, how they engaged. It's very interesting to me that we've done that. And I'm sure Dr. Mason has his thought on that.
Yeah, this aspect of anti-racist discourse, was being called anti-racism, is also part of the danger that I'm looking at and kind of scratching my head and shaking my head over, because I'll be in a classroom teaching, there'll be some kind of lesson going on, and then one of my racialized white students will say something to the effect of, oh, but you know, my perspective doesn't matter as much as your perspective as Black people. And so what I'm saying, if it's countering or different from what you're saying, then it should just be like thrown in the trash, not because I'm white. Listen, on one hand, I'm like, okay, I can appreciate the sentiment. On the other hand, I feel like people are just at a place where they're parroting what they are being told is woke or the right thing or the right side of racism and all this other stuff. I don't know if anyone actually believes that. I have a healthy amount of skepticism about that, but also it's like this weird infantilization of racialized Black people, racialized people of color across spaces. That's like, oh, we know that because of racism, you're very fragile. And I don't want to say anything that upsets you, even when it's just like a regular thing to say. Like what she said had nothing to do with anything. So the fact that she felt like she had to put a disclaimer in front of it, I'm like, no, like, oh, it just feels icky to me. Because again, it's this internalization of racism and quite literally playing out before our eyes. And now it might feel good to some of us who've been victims of racism, right? It might feel good to some extent to hear some of the self-flagellation happening around town, but to me it's like, oh, what is this? Like, what is this? You are confirming that there is a hierarchy, and then you're maintaining the hierarchy, and we're calling this liberation. It doesn't add up for me. It really doesn't add up for me. And then the presumption of course is always that as a racialized Black person or person of color, our experiences are all the same, which is the same as saying to Mukunda's point, it's the same as suggesting that we all think the same about a thing, which we don't even all think the same about the problem of racism. So we can't even agree what food we want to eat. So it's like, it's like, what is that? Like, why is that being put under the umbrella of progressiveness? It seems actually regressive to me. And the reason it's regressive is because, again, it's this trying to solve the real problems of racism through the language and the practice of race. And that is the problem. And so long as we continue to try to do it from that philosophy, we will continue to have these weird like quagmires.
It's akin to saying, hey, you're angry. Why don't you get more angry and talk in the terms of anger instead of talking in the terms of let's get beyond the emotional spectrum of our belief, right? It's just, I find the entire exercise, and I'm sorry if Dr. Kendi ever listens to this, is just, I just think the entire exercise of engaging with trying to get over race and deal with race through race doesn't solve anything. Like if your solution to a problem is the problem itself, then you're just going to have that problem over and over again.
Amen.
Right. I mean, for me, it's like ultimately, like, yeah, we could talk about culture and we could talk about the real important differences of culture and how we engage with each other from our cultural perspective. But I don't think, and maybe, and let me give a little bit of benefit here, is maybe the idea is that race is mixed up with culture in some sense in people's minds, and I can understand that. But I think from a philosophical perspective, when you separate the two, like, they are distinct things, because you can be culturally one, and she'll be back on, it happens. The UK, I mean, their internet probably is like whack. But I'm just saying, like, I find it so weird to me that this conversation occurs in this day and age, and we have a sense of like, we've already dealt with race, but part of me thinks this is a reaction, right? This is a reaction of, hey, we haven't got our time under the sun. And instead of being like, we need to solve the problem, it's let's even out the scales. It's that old school saying, if you hit me, I get to hit you, and equal out those scales, right? Instead of saying, okay, let's just find a place where we can actually engage with each other as equals and try to get over this. No, you hurt me, I gotta hurt you. Otherwise, if I don't hurt you, then we're not even. And I feel that's kind of what's going on.
Yeah, that's an idea that I've been exploring recently, because one question that came to mind fairly recent for me, enough to where I started thinking more deeply about it, is this question of, when will those of us in America feel like we've succeeded? against racism? When will we feel like we've succeeded against racism? What does success look like? And you have some people who are proponents for reparations, and they might say that if reparations are paid, then that could be success, right? But then outside of that, you have some people expressing the desire for the hierarchy to be inverted, for Black people to be viewed as at the top and white people to be viewed at the bottom. But then you have other people who, when asked the question, they're a little stuck because they haven't been asked the question and they don't know. Because I'm thinking of this discourse about police shootings. I'm thinking about this push to have a certain amount of representation across all disciplines and industries. And then I'm doing the math. Now, mind you, I'm in literary studies. I'm in the humanities. Not a trained mathematician by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm like, if 13% of American society is comprised of racialized Black people, then the expectation can't be that we're going to be represented 50% everywhere. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's just and I get the sense in how people tend to talk in absolutes with very little nuance. I get the sense that that's almost what people expect or are demanding to be successful against racism. And I'm asking people the question because I'm like, if that's the expectation, we will literally never achieve it, right? We will always stay oppressed and victims and marginalized because we don't even have the math right. Like, if we're 13% of the population, that's obviously including, people who don't work, babies, children, retired people, a small percentage of people that are unemployed. So the math doesn't add up. But it seems to me like people aren't being real about that fact. People aren't being real about this constant push and need to see oneself everywhere, as if seeing oneself everywhere is solving the problem or does anything to solve the problem. To my mind, it doesn't, because how Blackness is produced and how race is produced, more broadly speaking, tends to confirm racist ideas about groups of people, such that the representations fall short of actually solving anything for me, right? If the only thing we have in common is how we look, that's such a superficial commonality. So my hope is that we can push more or encourage more people to ask more critical questions, to really think more deeply about what does success look like, because we might come to find upon a further analysis that we've actually succeeded in a lot of the ways that we're convincing ourselves we haven't, like with the officers or with representation in different industries. And then that could enable us and free us up to focus on where we haven't succeeded, which I think you hit the nail on the head when you spoke about how in some ways race and class have become conflated. Mm-hmm. Certainly it's the case that not all racialized Black people are poor in America, but we do tend to be poor at a disproportionately high rate. And that, to me, is when racism matters most. It matters far less if somebody says something that I think is a microaggression. I think we should own our power and just let that, free ourselves from feeling any type of way about somebody else's ignorance.
So, Dr. Mason, if I can ask, how does your theory of racelessness deal with the now prevalent conversation about intersectionality, right? And most people misunderstand it, but especially when we see in the news how critical race theory, quote unquote, is taking over all schools, which I think is nonsense. But it's that nonsense being spread in the media. But I think, from your perspective, how does intersectionality and your theory of racelessness kind of interact with each other, if it does at all?
Yeah, so intersectionality is complicated for me for a couple of reasons, because I don't identify as feminist. This is another binary way of thinking that the West promotes, this idea that to be pro-woman, one has to be feminist or you hate women. There's a whole history of unaligned women, especially unaligned racialized Black women, who reject the category of feminism, but who are still, for all intents and purposes, doing the work of feminists. Yeah. And we know that Kimberly Crenshaw, racialized Black feminist, right, self-proclaimed, creates the term intersectionality, and then all feminists everywhere take it and use it for their own means. At the same time, I recognize that outside of the feminist framework, if feminism isn't being presumed, it can be very fruitful, because it strikes me that in some ways, Blackness has become a metaphor for being poor in American society, which we already know isn't statistically true, but that's just a metaphor. And then whiteness has become the metaphor for being rich in American society. So you have different pockets of populations believing that success looks like being white, you know? And like, first of all, that's so detrimental, because it's an inaccurate depiction of what success can look like, right? But there's a way in which a more sustained focus on socioeconomics, I think, would go further towards solving the problems that, at least to my mind, matter when it comes to racism, where it's not this sort of individual boogeyman of a so-called white person running around hating Black people. That to me doesn't matter. What matters to me is how it's systemic. And to me, it plays out in the system primarily through this disproportionate allocating of impoverishment toward people who look a certain way. And but then the ironic thing is, at least my research has shown, more often than not, the sort of universal policies that are implemented to solve for some of these class issues are more effective, have been proven to be more effective than some of the policies that have focused, like affirmative action, that have focused on race, right? And so it's ironic, because if you asked me this question a year ago, I would have said something different. Because I was under the impression that to solve racism, we have to focus on race, right? Like, that's, to me, I think that's a logical conclusion that most people make, but it doesn't bear out in actual reality and statistics and the data. So I think that also speaks to the need to properly name and identify the problem. And then if we identify that something like race and class are happening, like are relevant in a certain scenario, then we would do well to create and implement more universal policies to solve that, because we already know the policies that focus on race aren't as effective, historically speaking. So I think intersectionality matters in the sense that more often than not, it seems like whenever something bad happens to a racialized Black person or person of color, it's automatically racism. It's automatically, can't be anything else. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's inaccurate, right? And so the more we can do to investigate, to inquire, to figure out, are there other causes or things at play here? Are there other systems of oppression at play? I mean, I think that would lead to more fruitful solutions and outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the inherent view that we take that either an institution or an individual, prima facie is going to have racial intent for every action they do or interaction is, I think, a problematic position, right? Because human beings, I mean, first of all, like I'm not a big proponent of free will. I actually don't think we have free will, but that's a whole nother thing. But I think we tend to act out within the scope we're in that particular situation is, right? Like maybe someone's reacting out of anger because of their day, their whatever it is, like we're not rational beings, and we don't think about the way we're going to interact. And I do think in some sense, like you're indicating, race becomes this habit that's built into us over time by the reaffirmation of our interactions with either people that tell us that race is this way, so we start viewing race to be this way, and then it's reinforced all the time, and then we just kind of play this out in this like the psychological game in our own heads. And until you're able to break that cycle, I feel like you're trapped in it. And this is not just for Black people, it's for white people, it's for every other race that look around like half the people that are talking about colonialization, oh, the British did this, British did that. Yeah, they did it, but they're not doing it anymore. But if you keep looking at it and you'll constantly see that problem. But I don't want to be so facetious as to say that there's not problems that we have to look at. We have to think about this being racially focused, but I think not everything is. And we shouldn't go to that as the first step in our inquiry.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it's kind of this saying that circulates, if you have a partner and you have the desire to go through their phone just to see what they're up to, that you'll always find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's transferable to this, right? Like I think most people will always find proof for what they're actually looking for. And I don't think that so-called proof is actually evidence of the thing that they're looking for. It's just because we're bringing our own subjectivity to it, we will take it as confirmation that a thing is true, right? And I think that is so nefarious, because when I interact with all kinds of people all the time around the world at this point, it's like, if something happens, if somebody comes across as a jerk to me, maybe 5 years ago, Sheena, I would have been like, oh, it's because I'm Black, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm a lesbian, I have a wife, we have triplets, or I might play that card too. I might be like, you know what, it's because I'm gay. And I wouldn't have thought anything of it. I would have never stopped to question, like, but is it because I'm Black? How do I know? I would have just taken it for granted that was the reality, because that's how I was perceiving things, and that's how I was perceiving the world. But something along the lines of my intellectual and indeed emotional journey showed me and rendered more clearly that the same pernicious ways in which I'm like, listen, racialized Black people, racialized brown people, we're not all the same. For better, for worse, we're not all the same. Race homogenizers.
We're not all vanilla.
I found myself generalizing and washing over other people's differences based off of the system of racism. And I was like, wait a second, like this is ironic. I am being part of the problem because I'm looking at people this way. I'm really setting myself up, because then I'm predisposing myself to have certain interactions and to automatically make it about me and my race, instead of making it about them and their biases, or them just not having a bad day, or having a bad day, or them just being a jerk. Like sometimes people are just jerks, and it has absolutely nothing.
Most of the time they are. I think that's where most of the time that is the response. Like I do feel like most times when people are like terrible, it's because they're just being jerks. Like ultimately. No, but I was just going to intercede for 1 second, and because I mean, we've talked about this entire journey you've had, and you're talking about this shift. What was that aha moment, if there was one, right? Or was it like this long process where one day you just kind of wake up, you're like, holy crap, I see things differently, I feel differently about things? Or was it just like this, you just had this epiphany, right? Because it does shift, like everything, your relationships, and when you have those moments, whatever it is, whatever that change occurs, everything just kind of moves. It just, the window moves, and suddenly things are different. So if you can, right? And this is the power of knowledge, right? You're saying the liberating power of knowledge, which can, as it being a Hindu, for us, knowledge is liberation, right? So, yeah.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's beautiful. So for me, it was a long process, but I think it was a long process primarily because I didn't have anyone along the way teaching me alternatives or anything. Like, it was kind of accidental that I came to see the history and the literature in this way. And I had faculty, again, who supported that journey and supported me along the ways, and never restricted my imagination when it came to particular ideas or avenues. And so I just kept following the path. And then toward the end of my career, I got put in touch with Jacoby Carter. He's the chair of the philosophy department at Howard University and my mentor. I love him. He's the best. He's a social constructionist eliminativist. At the time,
that's a mouthful.
At the time, so that means that he sees race as a social construction. He says it's like a unicorn, but society attaches meaning to this unicorn, right? But it's really not real. And he argues that race should be eliminated from human society because there's nothing positive about being racialized. It's all pernicious. And so when I got put in touch with him, I learned about the philosophies of race that to that point, I didn't know existed. I didn't have names for it. So he taught me the 6 philosophies of race. I came to identify myself also as a constructionist, a eliminativist. And from that point on, he put me, and he gave me a bunch of texts and things in philosophy. There's an entire discipline on philosophies of race. He gave me a bunch of sources to read, and my mind just continued to expand. And then probably a full year later, it was like one day I was thinking a particular way, and it was like literally the next day I felt my mind opening, because the realization I had one day, kind of randomly. I mean, I think about this stuff day and night. I dream about the stuff. So I wake up, in the middle of a dream, of a thought where I'm trying to play out and find the answer to something, and something clicked, and it was like, oh, the things that I'm assigning to race, Blackness, the thing that's making it so hard for me to agree with myself at that point, it's not race. It's not race. It's like culture, it's ethnicity, it's nationality. It's just who I am as a human being, as a person. It has quite literally nothing to do with my race. I am not these things because I am Black. And once I had that aha moment, I felt my mind opening, and it seemed like everything else expanded for me. And I've had countless students express that happening for them too, like students initially being very resistant to the teachings, but thinking I'm crazy. And then all of a sudden I'll say something that to me is inconsequential. I'm just teaching, doing a thing. And then all of a sudden, like they describe it as like they felt their brain opening. And then from there was no going back to the old way of thinking. And I say that to say that it can happen for more people, because even I resisted my own ideas, which is that does sound crazy. But one day I literally woke up and was like, oh snap. And that's the realization I needed to have, to also realize I wasn't a constructionist, I was a skeptic.
Yeah.
Because as a skeptic, whereas Dr. Carter will say, just like Ibram X. Kendi, oh, you could be in a category while working to destroy the category. To me, I'm like, no, we can't. Can we though? I kind of pause and question, like, can we though? And I would say the answer is no in the US, because most people who say race is a social construction, like the average person, still talks about it in very naturalist ways, still talks about it in terms of, I'm biracial because my parents are Black and white, and the 1-drop rule and all this pseudoscientific stuff. So that, but in the same breath, they'll say race is a social construction. So for me, that's the quagmire of constructionism, and continuing to promote constructionist positions as it pertains to trying to achieve the liberation we seek. Because more often than not, people operating from within the category do have what seems to be an impossible time getting themselves outside of it.
Right.
But as soon as if you have somebody like me who comes along and says, oh, look, here's a different option, people across the spectrum are open to it. Because feel how you want about CRT, or feel how you want about the intentions of the people who are against CRT, but what they're saying is correct. In teaching race, we're teaching racism. They're actually right. Like, that's correct. And whether we want to say that they have bad intentions or whatever, that's another story, right? That's another story. We would do well to listen to what they're saying, because they're right. And there's a solution. And the solution is theory of racelessness, because then we can actually talk about the problem still and not ignore it. We can, the alternative isn't just doing nothing. We have an alternative where more people can get what they want, and we can actually solve the problem and stop persisting the problem.
Sure. Awesome. Shahada, I've been asking, go, you go. You get the next whatever number of questions.
I was just going to say that just because the reality is, whether it's religion, race, there's comfort in constructs, everything, because constructs is all around us. So you're going to face that opposition, because we're built to feel comfort in constructs. So even if you feel I'm a Black person or an Asian person, it's construct. There's comfort there because there's identity associated with there, isn't it? And I remember when you were talking about when you felt somebody might be racist towards you, it might be because of your gender, is it because of your race? Because we have those lenses, and I think most people don't have an open lens. We all have our lenses, but sometimes we take the lens off and feel, I want to see with my own eyes the reality. And I think sometimes reality really scares people because we've been created from birth to live under this construct, isn't it? So I think that's, for the masses won't get it. It might be like an academic concept, but maybe the masses won't get it. But I think it will, because like I said, with transgender, that things are changing, and it's changing really quickly. So I think if the onus is there, people can see the positive, because I think we're so mixed all around the world that because of social media, we take elements of different cultures, don't we, and different identity. So I think, I think people fear that, we'll be genderless people, we'll be apolitical people, be aracial people, and people maybe feel that that's deconstructing ourselves as society. So I think that's the fear on its basic fear. It's like this primal fear that we need that identity. So, and I totally get what you're saying, that we take race away, we individualize ourselves, don't we? But maybe people don't.
Well, Shahada, to that point, I think what we're saying earlier was race has become this proxy for everything, where it's become race. Race has become class, culture, ethnicity. It's become this proxy. So your point exactly is right because of that. That if you take away race, everyone feels like you're taking away everything about us, right? There's nothing left. But you're not. There's all these things, right? This is the point of racelessness, I think, is her point is, if we get rid of the term race and this idea of race, we're still left with the building blocks of what really makes us up as individuals and as people or groups or communities. It's not the race, it's these cultures, these ideas, these ethnicities, these languages, these other things that race becomes a proxy for, right? I mean, like the term Asian, what the hell does that mean? I mean, like, I'm Asian. How am I Asian, except for the fact I come from the subcontinent, right? Like, I mean, but we're grouped into these weird groups where we don't really connect to that, right? It's just that's imposed on us. But I'm sorry, I was speaking for you, Miss.
I was just saying, right, but the fact is that most of us like to be aligned to a group. We like to be we cricket, football, people like to support their own team. It's an innate desire. But I think that's the issue. But I think with change, we can realize that people need that individualism, but some people might want to still be associated with Black, because I asked my students this last week and I said, I'm going to be interviewing somebody about this, and they mostly Afro-Caribbean, and they did say to me, Miss, actually in the Afro-Caribbean community we actually associate ourselves with East African, Somalian, Jamaican. It's very different in how you will perceive someone who's African as well, like we do as Asians. Also, where you're from, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So we always subcategorize, and there's this hierarchy. And I think it's about eliminating this hierarchy, isn't it? That is the construct.
Yeah, it's hard because I also think people think, again, going to this idea that people tend to think in absolutes. As an eliminativist, as it pertains to race and racism, I don't actually believe that we can 100% get to a raceless society in the ways that we're discussing. I do think that it's a numbers game, that we just need the statistical majority of people to see the light, if you will, and adopt a new way of imagining themselves and other people, and a new vision for the future. And I think we're closer to that statistical majority than we think. And I also think that over time, then after a generation or so of racelessness in effect, that it could get to the point of there being no racism whatsoever, which by that I mean no person aligning themselves with race, right, or the idea of race. I think it would get to that because it would naturally die out, I would presume, if the majority of people have shifted the tides, and race would become a sort of historical concept to examine for the purpose of examining racism, right? So I say that to say that we don't need everyone to agree or to see this as being fruitful. It's a statistical majority. And I also think in terms of tribalism and the sort of natural inclination to feel like you're part of a tribe in a way, I think the shift that would happen, at least in American culture, would be, whereas right now, most people tend to understand America or American as defaulting to whiteness or white. Toni Morrison says this in Playing in the Dark. I think that when people take their power for themselves and the society starts to change around the individual's belief systems, that more people would write themselves into what it is to be American, and we would no longer accept the need to hyphenate or write ourselves onto American, right? Black American, Asian American, Chinese American, whatever. We wouldn't hyphenate ourselves. We would integrate ourselves, not assimilate, integrate ourselves into what it is to be American. And ultimately, I think, at least in the context of the US, that's required and necessary, because so long as we continue to think of ourselves as segregated, as separate and distinct along racialist lines, then the hierarchy is always going to exist. It's always going to be there. And again, not everyone is going to be on board with the shift, because some people, because human beings, we think differently about everything, right? But I think that the majority of people would be more inclined to do that and see the benefits of doing that, and see the benefits of rallying as a community toward the nation, as opposed to a nation being divided amongst its citizens, right? The fear right now that I hear expressed is like, people are legitimately fearing a civil war of sorts, right? Like they are on edge. And I think we'd be hard pressed to find many people who actually want a civil war to happen. There's a small minority, but I think most people would rather not have that happen. And I think in that way, there's no better time than now for these theories to exist. And then the last thing I'll say, Shahada, is it seems like, and I think the presupposition is like, oh, this is going to be a hard sell for most people. But I also say that it often seems like a hard sell for people who are racialized not as white, because for all intents and purposes, many people who aren't racialized as white know the realities of racism. Not all of us, but certainly many of us. And so, yeah, we can be definitely skeptical, and we also tend to feel inclined to identify with the race. But the thing to remember is that with the elimination of racism comes the elimination of whiteness, probably first, Dr. Carter would say. And can you imagine a world in which whiteness doesn't exist, and like, what would that world look like, and what changes would there be? This isn't about erasing Black identity or brown identity or anything. It's literally about just erasing the violence. And just because we've found some fruitful ways to deal with race and racism, and because there's some practical utility that comes with reconstructing Blackness in the ways that it's been reconstructed, doesn't mean that we should continue to subject ourselves to the violence that necessitates that construction in the first place, right? We would be better off if we got rid of the violence. And if what follows is a sort of expanded view of one's identity in relation to the bigger world, I don't think that's always necessarily a bad thing, because as you said, there are countless people in what would be considered the African diaspora who don't racialize themselves in the ways that most Americans presume. That should be evidence for us that our belief in this sort of diasporic unity is actually a fallacy. It exists in so much as we think it does, but it doesn't actually exist. So we're holding on to the unicorn, and we would do well to let go of it.
I mean, we're going an hour and a half now, and I know, Dr. Mason, we're taking a lot of your time. Shahada, do you have any other questions that you want to ask before we we roll along.
No, not so. There's loads of questions we can go on for hours, but I just think, you know, you've come across with so much passion and you've opened up a little bit of your personal life as well and just humanized your journey as well. And this really showed it's for the greater good, because when you hear the word racelessness, you think, oh, okay, another one demoted, another one taken off. But when you look into the purpose of it, and, you know, and like you said about being outcome driven, that we must have 50% ethnic minority groups in organizations. Sometimes the outcome driven has a good origins, but maybe the outcome isn't really equality that we assume that it is. So I think you've made me think about a lot of things that I had misconceptions as well.
So, Dr. Mason, do you have any last parting words for our listeners? And then, yeah, you know, we really appreciate your time and the knowledge you've dropped, and you know, the experience of engaging with you today and learning more about racelessness and about your amazing background.
I just want to state that you can find me at theoryofracelessness.org. To learn more, because I'm constantly thinking out loud. I think that's the way that we actually can have positive change, is people being willing to voice what they think and how they think, and think with other people. And to that end, I feel very fortunate and grateful to be here with you both today. Thank you for extending the opportunity to me and for engaging in good conversation. I'll be thinking about the questions you asked probably for a long time and obsessing over whether or not I answered them sufficiently. But I hope to come again and continue the conversation, because we can definitely talk about this for a long time.
Oh, and really quick for our listeners, when does your book come out and where can they expect to get it?
Yes. So Decolonizing the Racialist Imagination. It should come out March 2022. Definitely early 2022. And you'll be able to find it on the Palgrave Macmillan website, but also it'll be on Amazon.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Mason. Shahada, it's always been awesome to have you on board and interviewing. You've become my new online podcast partner. So
I keep interrupting.
No. I think I sometimes I take over too much, and I apologize. So I'll try to be better about that. So everyone, thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time on Brown Pundits Browncast.
Thank you.
Tune in next week for Browncast.